Two kids are playing with toys in a backyard. One boy proudly holds up his toy car and says, "I've got one of these, and you don't." The girl gets upset, runs home, and complains to her mom. The next day, they're playing again. Once again, the boy shows off his toy and says, "I've got one of these, and you don't." But this time, the girl doesn't react, she just keeps playing. The boy looks confused and asks, "Hey, why aren't you upset today?" The girl smiles, holds up her toy box, and says, "My mom told me, with this, I can get as many of those as I want." A young student was sitting at his desk, happily working on a family project for school. As he thought about it, he got curious and went to his teacher. "Miss, where do people originally come from?" The teacher smiled and said, "Well, according to our lessons, humans were created at the beginning, and families grew from there over time." The student nodded and went back to his work. Later, he went to the school lab where another teacher was setting up an experiment. He asked the same question. This teacher replied, "Humans evolved over time from earlier species, long, long ago." Now completely confused, the student rushed back to his first teacher and said, "Miss, you said people were created at the beginning, but the other teacher says we came from earlier species." The teacher laughed and said, "Oh, that's simple. I was explaining my department. He was explaining his." Early one morning in a quiet coastal town, a park ranger spotted an older man walking along the beach carrying a bucket full of seagulls. The ranger stopped him and said, "Sir, catching wildlife like this isn't allowed. You could be fined for this." The man smiled and replied, "Oh no, officer, these aren't caught for anything. They're my pets." The ranger frowned. "Your pets?" "Yep," the man said. "Every morning I bring them down here for a bit of exercise. I let them fly around, then I whistle, and they all come right back into the bucket." The ranger crossed his arms. "All right then. Prove it." So the man tipped the bucket, and the birds flew off into the sky. They both stood there watching the empty horizon for a few minutes. Finally, the ranger said, "Well, call them back." The old man looked at him and said, "Call who back?" "The birds." The man blinked and replied, "Birds? What birds?" An older gentleman walks into a high-end electronics store to buy his wife a new smart fitness outfit. The sales assistant shows him several models ranging from $200 to $400, the more advanced and transparent the tracking data, the higher the price. He picks the most expensive one and heads home. He gives it to his wife and asks her to go upstairs, try it on, and show him how it works. Upstairs, his wife thinks, "This thing barely even shows up on the display. I'll just wear nothing under it, return it tomorrow, and keep the refund." She steps out onto the balcony, completely unprepared for what she's about to reveal, and strikes a pose. The husband squints and says, "Good heavens! For that price, you'd think they'd at least calibrate the sensors properly." He didn't see the punch coming, but he should be able to update his firmware by the weekend. A married man was visiting his girlfriend when she asked him to shave off his beard. "Oh, Brian," she said, "please shave it off. I want to see all of your handsome face." "I can't," Brian replied. "My wife loves this beard. She'd kill me if I shaved it off. Please," she pleaded in a teasing voice. Brian finally gives in and shaves off the beard. Later that night, Brian crawls into bed while his wife is sleeping. She wakes up and feels his face in the dark. Then she says, "Oh, Kevin, you shouldn't be here now. Brian will be home shortly." An elderly man lost control of his old bicycle while trying to avoid a stray cat and ended up in a small roadside ditch. With some effort, he climbed out, dusting himself off. A kind woman driving by stopped and rushed over. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think so," he said, slowly standing up. "Come on," she insisted. "My house is just nearby. You can clean up, rest a bit, and I'll make sure you're not hurt." That's very kind of you, he replied. But I don't think my wife would like that. Oh, don't worry, she said, smiling. I used to be a nurse. I'll take good care of you. Still hesitant, but unable to refuse, he agreed. At her home, she helped him clean up, checked him over, and gave him a cup of tea. They chatted for a while, but the man kept looking uneasy. Finally, he stood up and said, I feel much better now, but I should really go. My wife is going to be upset. The woman laughed. Relax. She won't even know. I assume she's at home anyway? The old man shook his head and said, No, she's probably still stuck in the ditch. A sharp old shopkeeper was being audited by a strict company inspector, who kept lecturing him about rules and procedures, clearly enjoying throwing his authority around. As the inspector was filling out paperwork, he kept swatting at a few flies buzzing around his head. The shopkeeper smiled and said, Having trouble with those circle flies, are you? The inspector paused. Circle flies? Never heard of them. The shopkeeper nodded. Oh, they're common around markets. They're called circle flies because they usually hang around the back end of livestock. The inspector said, Oh, and went back to writing. A moment later, he stopped and looked up. Wait a second, are you trying to say I'm like the back end of livestock? The shopkeeper quickly replied. Oh no, sir! I have far too much respect for inspectors to even think such a thing. The inspector nodded, satisfied, and continued writing. After a short pause, the shopkeeper added quietly. Hard to fool those flies, though. A little old lady went into a pet supply store and picked up the most expensive cat food on the shelf. At the checkout, she smiled and said, Nothing but the best for my little kitten. The cashier replied, I'm sorry, but we need proof you actually own a cat before we can sell you that. So the lady went home and returned with her cat. The cashier checked and completed the sale. The next day, she came back and picked up the most expensive dog food. At checkout, she said proudly, Nothing but the best for my little puppy. Again, the cashier said, We'll need proof you own a dog. So she went home, brought back her dog, and bought the food. The following day, she walked in again, this time carrying a small box with a hole in the lid. She placed it on the counter and said, Now, I need you to do something for me. The cashier, curious, cautiously put a finger into the hole. She quickly pulled it back and said, You! That smells like poop! The old lady smiled and said, Exactly, now I'd like to buy 3 rolls of toilet paper.